afternoon and welcome. Please do continue to eat your lunches. We're going to go ahead and begin the program. I'm Dean Reuter, Vice President and Director of Practice Groups at the Federalist Society. Thank you all very much for being here today. We certainly appreciate what I think is going to be an important and interesting discussion. I want to begin by thanking in advance Jeff Dinwoodie, who's going to be our moderator. He was largely responsible for putting together today's program. So thank you for that, Jeff. And I'm going to introduce him very briefly. I understand bios are available online nowadays, so in the interest of moving right to the programming, let me just let you know that Jeff is an associate at Davis Polk's Financial Institutions Group here in Washington, D.C., where he regularly represents clients before the current SEC, FINRA, and the CFTC. Before that, importantly, he was an attorney in the SEC's Division of Trading and Markets, and he's been a good friend of the Federalist Society for years now. And let me turn it over to you, Jeff.
Thanks. So thanks for that, Dean, and thanks everybody for coming. Also wanted to thank Paul, Annette, and Troy both for your interest in the panel, your enthusiasm, and of course taking the time to do it. Before getting started, just wanted to cover a few quick housekeeping points. So look, there's obviously almost an endless list of topics and questions that we could cover in this panel. To keep ourselves organized, what we've decided to do is divide the time that we have for the panel into three main portions. So for the first half hour or so, we'll focus on the current regulatory landscape and hear the panelists' thoughts on many of the hot topics that the SEC, other regulators, and Congress are focused on today. After that, we'll take a look back in time at your tenures as commissioners. And then in the third portion, we'll look ahead to the future of SEC and financial regulation generally. Questions from all of you in the audience and comments are very much encouraged. What we'll do is we'll leave a block of time at the end of the panel, 10 or 15 minutes, and if you could hold your questions until then, we'll go around the room and go through them. Some folks from the Federalist Society will walk around. If you raise your hand, we'll walk around with microphones. Please wait until they come to you with the microphone. And so with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I think, Annette, it makes sense to start with you. So look, there's been a lot said and written over the past couple of years about Dodd-Frank. There's been a lot of focus on certain shortcomings and issues and challenges. Let's actually start off in a positive place, though, and hear your thoughts, as well as Paul and Troy can chime in as well, on what Congress got right in Dodd-Frank.
Well, first, thank you for having me here and for the Federalist Society being so ecumenical as to have a former Democratic commissioner on the panel. I'm probably the one who, of the three of us, has the most positive things to say, I suspect, Paul, about Dodd-Frank. But I think there are some things that the legislation got right, even if we have some issues with the implementation. I do think that, that we had come this far in the swaps market to have, such a mature market, multi-trillion-dollar market that was, largely unregulated, and that obviously could pose, serious risks to the financial system was really quite a surprise. So even if one takes the position that derivatives were not the cause of the financial crisis, certainly Dodd-Frank was an opportunity to address those issues. And so certainly what is Title VII, which is the regulation of the derivatives market, I think was probably one of the better thought out provisions. Unfortunately, the parts that have been difficult, as I said, certainly in the implementation, as I think a lot of people here would probably agree, the fact that the regulation was split between two agencies was very awkward, and we still are struggling with those jurisdictional differences. But again, in the long run, I think that made a lot of sense. I think the focus on systemically important financial institutions, in theory, I think is very important. Certainly, I think having gradations of regulation depending on sort of one's footprint in the marketplace makes sense. And I would say finally that, given the regulation of the swaps market and given the fact that we now have so many more products going through clearinghouses, I think, Title VIII, where there was a lot more focus on sort of the systemically important financial market utilities, and certainly our experience has been that those financial market utilities are critically important. I think that also made sense to focus on those issues. So I would say those are three that I would have, pretty positive things to say about.
Well, since there's silence, in terms of other positives.
Paul is stunned.
I'm happy to weigh in too, and in the sense of the spirit of keeping it positive. Also, I had to really scratch my head though to figure out, because I do. As you all know, probably Jeb Henserling is working on a draft, which I think he might unveil next week, of repeal and replace for Dodd-Frank. And so I think that is a really commendable effort, and so I'm anxiously awaiting what might come out of that. So out of the 2,319 pages of, I won't even characterize what I think the statute is, but, just suffice to say that if Chairman Dodd at the time had to say, well, in a similar thing to what Nancy Pelosi said about the Affordable Care Act, that we'll have to see what it's like in place until we know what's actually in it. I could focus on a couple of things that I think are salutary, and one is a little provision 939 capital A, which is basically a directive by Congress to the SEC and other agencies to remove references to credit ratings from their rules. And way back in 2003 or so, when I was commissioner with Cindy Glassman, we basically were advocating such a thing. And I remember there were a number of people at the SEC and the staff and on the commission who said, "Oh, well, that's impossible." But I think the SEC has done a pretty good job of tackling that. With respect to money market mutual funds was one real big area. One thing, Reg M, is kind of one issue that's still hanging out there, but we'll see how that proceeds. But I think that is one good thing that's come out of Dodd-Frank. The second thing is the Inspector General. So way back in 1950, there was a government reorganization plan that Congress passed that had to do with SEC and other agencies. And up until that time, the commissioners sat as a body and kind of decided, okay, we'll hire a new clerk in the mailroom and we'll do X, Y, and Z with respect to the SEC. And so in this reorg plan, basically Congress vested in the chairman decisions over human resources and budget and things like that. But what Dodd-Frank did was basically, as far as the Inspector General goes, specify that the IG should report to the commission rather than to just the chairman. And so I think that has been a really good development. It's, the chairman used to have a very vested interest in the IG. And we saw, I think, frankly, when Mary Shapiro was chairman, how bad that could get with respect to issues like the leasing issue that the SEC had and other things that happened, which probably didn't get as full vetting as they should have with respect to the activities of the chairman. So I think that's, those are two things I would sort of point to.
Let me kind of build on those points and answer it in a little different way, which is, whether we think about it in terms of good or bad, and you can see some different views, and you'll hear more over the course of the next hour. And I can't think of a speech after Dodd-Frank came out when I was at the SEC where at least somewhere in the speech I didn't talk about the overregulation and overreach of Dodd-Frank. And one of, I think, the challenges, even in trying to identify something somebody likes, is to Paul's point, we don't have isolated pieces of legislation or isolated changes to the federal securities laws or the Bank Holding Company Act, what have you. You have the totality that is Dodd-Frank. And so one, I think, challenge when we're thinking about regulatory change is not to just think about any particular provision in isolation, but recognize the totality of what's being wrought. Because it could be the case that, yes, we can identify something in a particular piece of legislation. Well, that something has some redeeming quality, but if the price we have to pay is we get the rest of it, then on a cumulative basis, it's simply too much. And I think one of the big challenges for policymakers going forward, and I think it's an important kind of refinement to the notion of cost-benefit analysis, is thinking about cumulative costs as well as cumulative benefits. But when you think about the cumulative costs, you could have a piece of legislation, you could have a particular provision where you look at it in isolation and say, well, that makes sense. You could have another statutory provision and say, well, that makes sense. You could have a third and a fourth and a fifth and say, well, on their own, they each make sense. But then you ask the question, what about all five together? And you say, well, of course not. You would never do all five together. And so often what we get is we get all five together, all 10 together, all 20 together. And if you just look at things piece by piece, it can belie the complexity and the overburden of the total package. And right now we're living with the total package of Dodd-Frank. I think we're already starting to see some of the deleterious effects. We think about, for example, liquidity in the fixed income markets and the like being seen to dry up. There could be a lot of explanations for that. One that folks point to is the abundance of regulation. But this cumulative impact point, I think, is a lens that is important to bring to bear in assessing any legislative development, and think about it in toto, in addition to thinking about, again, the merits and demerits of any piece, not overlooking the cumulative impact that's brought to bear.
So look, a sort of related question that I've been thinking about, Troy, and maybe we'll start with you on this. In some ways, it's potentially contradictory to what you've just described in terms of the cumulative impact. But if you look at things in isolation, are there any areas that you can point to that you've been thinking about saying, hey, this is a missed opportunity? Dodd-Frank did all these things, but there's a missed opportunity here.
Yeah, so if one thinks, and there may be people who have different views on this, but if one thinks that the root cause, or at least a root cause, of the financial crisis, it was the housing market, then housing. And Fannie, Freddie, GSE's housing finance was not addressed. And so I'm a big believer in trying to identify and address root causes, because if what you instead focus on are symptoms and behaviors, and you go after a particular behavior or what we can think of as a symptom, but you haven't actually rooted out the cause, that's just going to pop up someplace else. And the thing that pops up, frankly, may be worse than the thing you thought you cured, because you haven't really addressed the problem. And so from a root cause perspective, I think that's a point that you may find a lot of agreement among different folks, that was something that was not addressed and still needs tending to.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the biggest disappointment was that the financial regulatory system was not restructured. And I'm sure you agree with that. The fact that we had a crisis of that magnitude and an opportunity to look at the multiple regulators who we have addressing similar issues. We have overlaps, we had gaps, and really we ended up with virtually the same number of regulators. We eliminated the OTS, but we got the CFPB and FSOC and all the other structures as well. I mean, really, obviously that was probably for political reasons that they were unable to reach consensus, but that has exacerbated the problems. It's a combination of Dodd-Frank regulating a huge number of activities sort of across the board, but with the same number of regulators, a lot of regulatory overlap, and worse yet, there are a number of situations in which the regulators have to coordinate, and that has been a major problem. I think the case in point, the logical one, the classic one is the Volcker Rule, where you had 5 regulators who had to coordinate to do the rulemaking. That was extremely difficult. It took them a very long time, and now the interpretive questions are supposed to be done jointly as well, and that's been extremely difficult to get consensus on, and therefore there's very little guidance on what to do. Just getting pretty simple FAQs out of the agencies have been a real challenge, and so that I think has sort of made it much more difficult for the financial industry to cope with the regulations.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think the huge missed opportunity is not reforming everything. So the Office of Thrift Supervision finally expired, put out of its misery, but we got 13 new other offices and regulatory agencies in its stead. And so, there had been a lot of work prior to the financial crisis done by Treasury and others. There was a Treasury blueprint talking about Twin Peaks and other things like that, other approaches. And the biggest tragedy, of course, in Dodd-Frank going through is that it was Christmas treed with lots of little political things like conflict minerals, mineral extraction, things that had absolutely zero to do with the financial crisis, pay ratio for CEOs to workers, and all this other things. And then you saw the SEC, unfortunately, through its chairman, decide to do all the political ones first. So the ink wasn't even dry on Dodd-Frank when the SEC came out with its ill-fated proxy access release, which of course was blown out of court with a judge writing the opinion calling it unutterably mindless, at least the way they were trying to apply it to mutual funds. So anyway, so the huge missed opportunity, I think, was really focusing on the root causes of the financial crisis, and it will happen again, obviously, where the bubble's building, we don't know exactly where, and it's going to burst, and here we go again. So
And so, Paul, you actually, just right there, you said it will happen again with bubbles bursting. It makes me think of FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council. So look, a lot of concerns have been raised over the years, both in terms of procedural points as well as the structure of FSOC. Curious to hear your views on that, and also more generally, what should FSOC be focused on a going forward basis?
Yeah, well, so FSOC, I think in a way, the concept of it's not such a bad idea. The Financial Stability Oversight Council kind of builds on what used to be the President's Working Group for Financial Markets, which came out of the big problem of long-term capital management and whatnot in the late 90s. So the idea was to get everybody sitting around a table and chatting about things. And there's some good things about FSOC, like, for example, there's the concept of having, if there be some sort of intractable difference between two of the members of FSOC, then the whole group sits around and kind of arbitrates between them and chooses. So FCC versus CFTC, which of course was another missed opportunity in not combining those two agencies, but anyway, out of the financial crisis. So there is some element of that in FSOC, but the trouble is, it was very poorly conceived. The Treasury Secretary has a veto power over it, which injects politics into the whole thing, which these issues, that's another terrible thing out of the financial crisis, is how political things have become. And just the fact that, when Annette referred to herself as a Democrat commissioner, I find that just so, sad that back in the old days, when I used to work for Arthur Levitt and Richard Breeden, we never really thought of who was what. And when Richard Shelby changed his party affiliation from Democrat to Republican, Rick Roberts, who was the commissioner, did the same thing because he had worked for Shelby before. And so we all had to kind of like dive for our books, rule books, to see, well, what does that mean, if there was a change. So back in the old days, nobody really thought about it. Unfortunately, 20 years later, people do. So I think the real problem is that then the FSOC has this political agenda. Basically, the Fed is really in the driver's seat. That lacks due process, rule of law. There's no transparency, as the judge even found in the MetLife case here a month or so ago. And so the real question is, I think, out of all of this, and what a hash the Fed has made out of this, going back to Graham Leach Bliley, there was a big discussion as to whether or not to get the Fed completely out of supervision and regulation. I think the time for that has come. So I hope that is one thing that we'll see happens, to really put the Fed back in its box and have it just do what it, even if you can argue that it does a good job on that, monetary policy, whatever. The concept of having mandarins in Washington sitting around a table, peering into their crystal ball, and with enough information and just their brilliance, inherent brilliance, they can prick bubbles before they happen, I think is a fool's errand, and we shouldn't hang our head on it.
I'm a little more positive on the FSOC, although there certainly are challenges. I mean, there certainly are challenges, and I think the FSOC was formed in part as the compromise, right, for the fact that we did not have financial regulatory consolidation. So it's like we'll all form a committee and coordinate. And so some of the issues, obviously, that they focus on are really quite important when you're focused on what are the sort of macro issues of financial stability and what should regulators be focusing on. But it's like any other committee or body. They don't agree on things. Everybody gets a vote, and not everyone has the same expertise on particular issues. So I do think that I think the SEC is likely to get the most pressure there because which was exactly the same case with the President's Working Group. When I staffed the President's Working Group, most of the meetings involved SEC issues because the SEC was the market regulator. So it was, well, what is the SEC doing? What do you have to say? It was like a show and tell for the SEC. And I think a lot of what happens in the FSOC is the same. So there's a little bit of problem, with the SEC trying to, do what is in its mandate and yet getting pressure from the FSOC to perhaps do things a little differently, or having the Fed insinuate its views in terms of what should happen with money market funds or whatever. I mean, there's obviously, many challenges with that structure. So, and I think there are, some concerns about transparency, although I think they've made, a good bit of it public, not everything, but it's sort of where we are, unfortunately. Tell it to the judge. Well, not everything with respect to their decisions on designations, but there are minutes that are public. But in any case, I think, as I said, I think it was done partly as a compromise because they did not consolidate the agencies.
I think one of the concerns, I think it echoes much of what Paul was saying, that I have about the FSOC is the potential for it, by virtue of the way it's structured, to erode the independence of independent agencies, the independent financial regulators, and that's to the extent that happens, that's a profound concern, at least on my part, because it really goes to the underpinnings for why we have independent agencies like the SEC, like the CFT. One, expertise; two, independence. The basic argument being the independence allows them the room to exercise their expertise. And that one may not like every single decision that a particular agency arrives at, but that over time, the combination of expertise and independence is a good way for those agencies to go about the nitty-gritty work that they have in front of them. Well, with the structure of the FSOC, and this was alluded to, it's not, for example, the SEC that's a member, it's just the chair in his or her personal capacity as the chair who's the member, whether that's the CFTC, whether that's the SEC, or what have you. So when you think about that structure, you think about the transparency concerns that have been raised. You think about the ways in which folks can lean on the chairs of other agencies to try to sway them to move policy and rulemaking in one direction or another. Those have the effect, or can have the effect, of eroding those independent agencies' independence, not in the strict textbook sort of way, but in the practical, on the ground, how do things really happen sort of way. And I think that's very significant. I think it's too early to know exactly how that concern will play itself out. Right now it's a concern. We'll see with more time what that ends up amounting to. Hopefully not much. Hopefully my concern proves to be unwarranted, but it's a worry I have that's based in the structure of the FSOC itself. Now, one bit I would argue of silver lining in all of this is the MetLife decision, where the court overturned the designation of MetLife as a systemically important financial institution, an opinion that's gotten a lot of attention, bringing to bear, in effect, requirements of cost-benefit analysis through the application of the Administrative Procedures Act. So we don't need to get in, those folks want to, the nitty-gritty around the APA and all the rest. But it's a really important decision that I think has implications beyond just the FSOC, because it really is, I think personally, a coherent, sound, concise articulation of the APA and what it requires of government bodies that are subject to it, just as a matter of good, sound decision-making, set aside whether or not one likes the outcome of any regulatory process, just what the demands are when you're trying to reach a balanced decision that thinks about the pros and the cons of any action you're going to take.
You know, I agree with Troy that the jury's out in terms of how it's going to, work long-term. I do think, and Paul alluded to this, I don't think it's had an impact ultimately on what an agency like the SEC has, where they've come out as a body. I do think it has affected their ordering of how they address things when there's sort of consensus within the FSOC that something needs to be moved to the front of the line, whether it's money market funds or, mutual fund issues, asset managers. I get the sense that what happens is that becomes sort of a priority, but that the SEC has attempted to maintain their independence in terms of how they address it and in asserting their expertise, at least as to now. I think that's what they're doing, which is very important and very healthy, because I couldn't agree more that the importance of having an independent agency, is critical. And if you lose that in this process, then that's really not what was intended when these regulators were established.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about if you were representing the SEC, which is another issue that we have to talk about at some point, that the chairman of the SEC is basically the representative. It's not the commission or whatever, but leaving that aside, if you're the sole capital markets person sitting around this table and you're looking at 9 other people most of whom are bank regulators, that's not necessarily a comfortable position to be in. Or if you are somebody like Roy Woodall, who's the only insurance expert on the thing, and if you read his dissents in both the Prue designation as a sci-fi and MetLife, also that designation, I mean, they're scathing of the staff's work, of the rationale of the FSOC as a body, and how they don't basically know anything about insurance. So that's just kind of an insight into how those discussions must go, but it's actually really troubling. So I salute the judge who had found fault with the designation process for MetLife, and salute MetLife actually for challenging the whole thing.
So look, we can obviously talk about Dodd-Frank for the next several hours, and there's obviously a lot of different issues to talk about, but I think it makes sense. Let's pivot to another big issue that's on the SEC's agenda, which is equity market structure. As people in this room, most of you will know, this has been a big area of SEC focus over the last several years, including, among other things, the SEC chair giving 2 big speeches 2 summers ago, laying out a very ambitious agenda of market-related reforms. And so with the acknowledgement that's a very broad question, I want to start with you, Troy, and just say, and hear your thoughts on both. Do you think the SEC is taking the right approach with what they've been doing, including setting up an advisory committee and doing some rulemaking sort of at a snail's pace? And if you have any thoughts on what's the best approach going forward?
So this is one of those topics, like many topics, where I think the challenge for the agency has been there's an issue and you go after the issue, then there's another issue, you go after that issue, there's another issue, you go after that issue. And so you're constantly going after some new issue that presents itself. And folks, including my former colleague at the Commission, Dan Gallagher, myself, have talked about, Paul probably has as well, maybe even Annette as well, but this notion of a holistic review, sometimes I refer to instead as a first principles type of an approach, which is to say, instead of trying to go after the latest issue that's capturing folks' attention, we need to take a step back and have a bottom-up, holistic, first principles, however you want to characterize it, assessment of our market structures, including the regulatory regime. And as we think about various behaviors, whatever that may be, speed in the marketplace, fragmentation that people talk about, I would just drop a note. People talk about fragmentation. I'm always quick to say I think about that in terms of competition. And if you talk about it in terms of competition and choice, that's a very different flavor than if you think about it in terms of fragmentation. But however we want to label it, however we want to characterize it, is instead of going after all of these different pieces, not to suggest they're not important, we need to take a step back and try to figure out what's really going on, what's giving rise to all of this. And it may be part of the regulatory regime. It may be other influences on incentives. It may be other technological developments. Had we taken those sorts of steps a few years ago, that sort of an analysis may have been done by now. And we may be on to then having the firm foundation, this kind of holistic first principles-based perspective to then say, all right, what do we want to do? That takes a lot of time, energy, effort. I think with the advisory committee, it kind of speaks to that. The focus on data, which has been a focus over the last few years when it comes to market structure questions, I actually think is a very good thing. One of the things that the studies have demonstrated in many instances is that stuff that people thought were features of the markets, in fact, not so much. And that's important too, because you got to have the right understanding of the markets in order to figure out what to do and in order to try to anticipate what the consequences would be if you do something. So data economics as a foundational basis for any decision that's going forward, but also this holistic first principles approach, I think is important, or else I think what we're going to do is we're going to address an issue today, something else is going to pop up, we're going to try to address that issue tomorrow, and we may, in fact, in the process, not only not be making things better, we may actually be taking steps back, because the thing that manifests itself next may actually be worse than the thing that we thought we were curing. So in my kind of perfect world on this, it would be that sort of an approach. Again, I think there are aspects of that which you can see at play, but I think commitment to that from all interested parties and the willingness to then figure out what's going to be best for the markets over the long term is the way to go.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I see Peter Haller over here who's with IEX. And so, IEX has, demonstrated some of the inherent flaws of the current system. So I think that's, good luck to you all in your application. But, so it's really forcing the SEC to focus. And unfortunately, I think, time is swiftly coming to a close with respect to, a real soup to nuts review of market structure, which I do think is long overdue. And obviously didn't support NMS when it was adopted by the commission back, a dozen years ago. And I just, ultimately the SEC has gotten the market structure that it, wanted. So with all the pros and cons of that, but the real thing, I think this is what IEX points up, is that, that choice is important, and investors and participants in the marketplace ought to have choice. Unfortunately, the SEC took that away from them. So anyway, but hopefully there will sometime here in the relatively near future, we'll get what Troy's been talking about, a soup to nuts review.
Well, I'm never quite sure what soup to nuts review means, in the sense that timing is everything, and it's important. The market keeps changing as we're studying, so I think that's the challenge. Is how do you, how can you be comfortable that you're looking at something that is going to be the same by the time you're making your decisions? That said, I think that the information that the regulators have now to work with is far better than it was before. I think what you see, the analysis that you see, DERA doing at the SEC is very commendable. The amount of information, the data that they share that academics can look at is very, very helpful. And so so I do think that, first principles is, market quality and fairness. And fairness, I think, has two elements. One is it fair? The other is there a perception of fairness? Because I definitely think whether the markets are fair or not, there's a perception in some cases, certainly with respect to things like market data and the like, that it's not fair. There are concerns about that. And I think if, you start with that and you look at, what is execution quality? How does the pricing compare to what it used to be? Where is it we want it to be? Are the markets linked the way we think they should be or not? Do we have too many order types? Is that causing confusion? All of these things, I think we're probably in a better position to address than we've been in a long time. And I think it is important to continuously look at these issues and look at the markets. The markets have not stood still. They're not where they were when Reg NMS was done. Europe has markets that have developed quite similarly to the U.S. without Reg NMS. I think a lot of these things have been driven by technology, the speed with which a lot of these things can be done. So it's healthy, and in fact, the SEC's responsibility to continually assess these things and ensure that, given the changes that occur in the marketplace, that that the regulations are sort of appropriately calibrated.
If I can just add one point to that, which is an aspect of first principles, when I think about it here, is not just in terms of what are kind of the characteristics in terms of the outcomes that we like, efficiency, what have you, low trading cost, and the like. But I think in the following way too, which is, what should the role of the government be in micro-engineering our equity market structure? Right. So for me, the first principle is a very fundamental question here of how much should things be left to the market to figure out now that you have a lot of different trading venues, which again, if you think about that in terms of competition and choice, that may argue for less government involvement in terms of trying to figure out every fine point about what the market ought to look like and orienting a rule to that, versus when should the government have more of a role in figuring out and mandating and prescribing the rules of the road that are going to define the market itself. I mean, I've sometimes quipped almost as a joke that, if you think about the totality of the regulatory regime that lays out all of the detailed requirements for our equity market structure, it does make one wonder if the word market is the right word. And I say, as I said, in part by way of a quip, but it really is a simple way of capturing this point about how much should this be left to the commission to prescribe in very fine detail versus are we at a point, because there's so much choice and there's competition, for the government itself through the SEC to take a step back and allow more by way of private ordering and the marketplace to come up with its solutions. So that's a fundamental question that I think is part of the assessment without knowing exactly where one would come out on every aspect of that question.
And so, look, that's obviously, it's an area we could do a whole nother panel on. So, let's turn the page. And, originally I wanted to cover and get thoughts on the role of bank regulators in the current environment. But just because we're getting a little short on time, let's jump to another hot topic, which is political disclosure. And so, as a lot of folks in this room know, that a lot of people and some members of Congress have been putting pressure on the SEC to require companies to disclose their political spending. Paul, let's start with you, and if you could just lay out maybe the pros and cons of any such SEC rulemaking.
Yeah, well, it's a huge topic, but I think when you look at all the things that have gone on, Mary Jo White has really put it very well as far as what this issue is all about. And just about a couple 2-3 weeks ago, the SEC came out with a concept release looking at the rules regarding disclosure by corporations called Reg SK, which was a great, I think, a real step forward that the SEC did way back in the 1980s. Linda Quinn was the head of corporation finance at the time, and the concept was, let's get all the rules together, because there had been like higgledy-piggledy rules, that you had to chase around the rule book to figure out. So everything in one place, and over time, of course, things have grown. And Mary Jo White has talked about the need to refocus on materiality. And I hear this when I talk to large asset managers and small asset managers around the country. The first thing off their tongues is how much people are drowning in kind of in information that's not material to their investment decision. And the trouble is that the things that are not material drown out then the materiality part. So political disclosure, quote unquote, is one of these issues. This is not about political disclosure. Corporations already have to disclose if they give money to candidates. This all comes down to basically trade associations and the 501c4s and things like that. So the idea is from politicized activists. So you have activists who are on one stripe going after, the companies with respect to economics. And so that's one thing, more power to them. Politicized activists, going all the way back to Saul Alinsky in his book Rules for Radicals. In the penultimate chapter, it was called Target Proxy. So Saul Alinsky figured out that the real way to get your voice heard and to affect change in corporations is to try to get things onto the proxy card and to basically beat the drum enough to, with an interim effect, to have management of corporations bow to your wishes. So that is the same thing with respect to this issue. Politicized activists have been focusing on it in all different types of ways. But what's really amazing is if you look at all of the big money managers, the top 5, 7 of them, whatever it is, they vote against these shareholder proposals, something like 99% of the time or something like that. And the ones that there's like a floor around 20%, 22%, something like that, of people who vote for it, and it comes from basically state pension funds, union pension funds, and then funds that vote according to the proxy advisory firms, ISS and Glass Lewis, who tend to support these things. So Mary Jo White has realized, and I think articulated very well, that this issue is better left to other agencies who are into the or Congress itself, frankly, who are into this issue, who can look at, the pros and cons of what kind of disclosure is necessary. If the SEC would act, it would only affect corporations. Funny enough, it wouldn't affect unions or other expenditures that way. So the whole thing, and if you look at how these particular proposals have morphed over time, it is all about, a name and shame type of thing when they are trying to get corporations to disclose their lobbying. That's how most of these things have morphed from pure political disclosure. When they've figured out that, in fact, corporations already have to disclose things, it's gone really towards lobbying and donations to trade associations. So it's very politicized, and I salute Mary Jo for saying that this is not really what the SEC should be about.
Yeah, I think Mary Jo, has really hit the nail on the head. There's been, as you probably know, a long tradition of the SEC being pressured to add items that are of sort of political significance to particular groups or members of Congress to the SEC disclosures. And it's not that these things shouldn't be public, but that's not the venue, and that's not the SEC's mission, I don't think. And so I think it's been sort of a constant struggle over the years for the Division of Corporation Finance to try to be somewhat pure in maintaining their goal of having material information that investors, want to see, in the corporate disclosure. So it's a very, as Paul said, a very, very political and politicized issue, and something that the Commission, I think, is going to continue to have to grapple with.
So at this point, let's actually turn back in time and take a look at your tenures as commissioners. An interesting place, I think, to start is surprises, and it's looking back years later. Are there any issues that you worked on or that you focused on that turned out differently than how you were thinking about it at the time? I'd love to hear from all of you on that, but let's start, Troy, if you have any thoughts.
Sure. Since I left, I guess most recently a few years back, at some level, I'm gonna have a better insight on that a few years from now, just because these things take a while to play themselves out. One where it's a rule that I supported. I guess by support, I voted for. There's always a lot that goes into a decision to vote for or against something. It was one that I voted for, although I had my reservations. But I think looking back, my reservations perhaps should have been even more acute than they were, and that's Form PF. And I won't get into the details around what Form PF is. It requires a bunch of reporting by private funds. That's one where, again, as I look back, the concerns that I had, I think perhaps should have been even more acute than I had at the time. So kind of notch that in that category. Another is cyber, in the sense that I personally was starting to think about it, but was not speaking out about it. And given the significance of the issue, it's one as I look back where I say, is there something where maybe I should have been more publicly involved and engaged? That would probably go, frankly, in that camp. There were a lot of things, again, where you vote for, you vote against, and you'll see how they ultimately play themselves out. Part of it, too, on the question of surprises is, you never know for sure exactly how things are going to play themselves out. I mean, this kind of echoes, my being a staunch proponent of cost benefit. I mean, I think if you sit back and you say, look, I'm going to do the best I can and talk to a lot of different folks with lots of different perspectives and try to identify how this could go well and how this could go poorly. If you do that robustly, then when you look back, the element of surprise is somewhat dissipated, only in the sense that, I knew that it could play out well, even though I voted no, or I knew it could play out badly, even though I voted yes. I think in large respect, you're then kind of looking at magnitudes, and with just even still a few years in the rearview mirror, I think is a little soon to tell. But those are a couple that jump to my mind. The only other thing I would quickly note, because it really goes to the essence of the question, is the importance of retrospective reviews, because part of this too is I'm sure if I looked at every single vote I ever took or everything I considered and did a systematic analysis, I may say, I never would have thought it was going to be quite this way or quite that way, which I think just goes to the point of the SEC, other regulators for that matter, I think needing to do more by way of rigorous retrospective reviews to look back at significant rulemakings and say, hey, is this rulemaking more costly than we thought? Maybe there's actually more benefits than we thought. It doesn't tell you which way that review is going to come out. Cost-benefit analysis is prospective. You anticipate outcomes. Retrospective review is backward-looking. You have outcomes. That's a really good exercise to then reassess. Maybe we need to do more of what we were doing. Maybe we need to pull back, notwithstanding the best of intentions. It didn't quite go the way we wanted. I think that's an important thing to do, and it really gets at the basis of your question, frankly.
I think I'd answer it from a little different perspective, which is when I look back and think about what we did and what really worked even better than I thought it would. I think that the Commission's response to 9/11 was really extraordinary. I don't think we could have predicted at the time that the staff would have stepped up the way they did, that the Commission would have been as creative as it was in coming up with things that we could give relief for in order to assist the markets at the time. I think the ability of the automation review people, who I don't think we fully appreciated their capabilities, the way they went and worked with the markets to ensure that when they came back up that they were ready to do that and that they wouldn't sort of go down again in a way that would cause tremendous panic to the system. All of those things I think were really quite gratifying. I think what came out of it also, the amount of attention on things like business continuity, which has turned out to be critically important and something that even today we focus on a lot. It relates to even to the cybersecurity issues. I think that was very positive, and the Commission comported itself very well. I think it was in some ways, if you look back, it was one of the high points of the Commission really showing what it was capable of. It's also sort of bittersweet, because when you look back, you realize how in a crisis like that, the regulators actually worked very well together in a way that perhaps we're not in quite the same kumbaya moment right now. It did seem like the jurisdictional issues sort of fell to the side, and people worked very much together, and actually even competitors on Wall Street stepped up and assisted others, providing space or things like that, or all manner of assistance to competitors to bring the markets back up. So a little different type of answer, but one where I do think we couldn't have predicted that it was going to go as well as it did.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think that's thanks to all the leadership there at the SEC. I wasn't there at the time, but and then the hard work of the staff and the others. So that was really great. So, and I guess to the question there are a couple things that come to mind as far as votes go. One is, so I was just talking about political disclosure, that whole issue. So that brings up the whole proxy voting disclosure rule, which is the first first rule that I voted no on. So it's 20646, it's called now. But I think I kind of anticipated that there would be lots of costs to it and unintended consequences, but I didn't realize that, and here in retrospect, to look at how the proxy advisory firms, ISS and Glass Lewis, have gotten so much market clout because of that rule, and really because of a following staff no action letter that basically told mutual funds that in order to fulfill the responsibilities under 20646 that they could basically fob off analysis to these advisory firms. So I think that's one thing that, of course, the SEC has to look at again in Congress itself. There was a hearing that was held just in House Financial Services last week, I think, or so the week before, regarding that. So at some point, I think that will be addressed. 20647 is another rule called the compliance rule that was adopted at about the same time in 2003. But I'm disturbed that looking at some of the enforcement actions that it's now being used as a cudgel against chief compliance officers, and I don't think it was intended that way at all. I voted for that rule, in fact, at the time. And then finally, a third one was the rule that I really regret most of all voting for, and that was had to do with Sarbanes-Oxley 404, so the internal control review requirement of Sarbanes-Oxley, and Audit Standard 2, which is of PCABO, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, mouthful, which was created by Sarbanes-Oxley. But Audit Standard 2 was way too in the weeds and had a huge expenditure of funds by companies large and small. We tackled that when all the problems started to come up, and approved Audit Standard 5 at the time, and I thought that would have driven the stake through the heart of that whole move, to really nitpick the whole internal control review aspect. But apparently it's back. I hear, apparently even from the chief accountant of the SEC, I was on a panel with him not too long ago, and at SEC Speaks, and so those issues are coming back again. So I think this whole aspect of Peekaboo and the SEC and the interaction of them, and especially in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision that says that the SEC is the one to have really plenary authority over Peekaboo, or else it is unconstitutional, I think is a really important lesson that we need to carry forward.
Annette, in your response, you alluded to the importance of coordination among regulators. And I know working with you now for the last 5 years, it's something that we spend a lot of time on, both with domestic clients and non-U.S. clients, on regulatory coordination, both within the U.S. and with non-U.S. regulators. It'd be interesting to hear you comment on what you observed when you were a commissioner versus what you perceive to be the case today.
Yeah, I think, since the financial crisis, the amount of coordination among regulators internationally has increased substantially. We used to, have IOSCO, and that had, some influence on the Commission's work, but since the financial crisis and the commitment of the G20 to basically coordinate on a lot of initiatives, and the formation of the FSB, which is the Financial Stability Board, which is the successor to the Financial Stability Forum that I served on for over 9 years. I mean, it's taken a very, very different role. I mean, the FSB, unlike its predecessor, really does a lot more actual work. I mean, they don't just sort of recommend that things be done. They do studies, they make recommendations, they get their members to agree to do rulemakings that are consistent with those recommendations. So, and that does have some, impact on the SEC's agenda. And so I think the amount of coordination is much greater, and I think the requirements to coordinate really come at the highest levels of the government through the G20 agreements.
Yeah, I just second that. If you look at the FSB, it's sort of, whenever you hear financial stability, just think bank regulators and oy vey, it's a real problem because of the conceit by the bank regulators that they can bring financial stability. And overall, if you listen to Governor Tarullo of the Federal Reserve, who openly talks about what he's coined a new term, market prudential regulation. And that's the idea of bringing into the capital markets, and especially to asset managers, the idea that, the government, in its great wisdom, can say thou shalt not sell a particular type of security for fear of, making more turbulent the markets. But that's the surefire way of making the markets even worse and even more volatile. So unfortunately, these bank regulators don't understand the marketplace, and that's then translated onto the international scene. The Financial Stability Board, with Mark Carney as the chairman, says this similar thing. So there are 35 members of this FSB. There are only 3 capital markets regulators, and that's SEC and then 2 European regulators. So they are at the kiddies table. Everybody else is a central banker sitting around it. And so you can see where that ultimately goes. And so I think that is a real, scary situation for our capital markets. And even, see what Troy says to this, but if you look at, with IOSCO, with a money market mutual fund debate, but you, Gallagher, and Aguilar had a dissent, and I don't know that really affected anything at IOSCO. They went charging ahead mainly, I guess, because the chairman at the time was, in obviously had cooked up the whole debate there. But anyway, I think it's really interesting to see the SEC. I hope will continue to be engaged on the international scene, and I just think it needs to carry a bigger stick in many ways.
On a number of those points, a lot of people talk in terms of, these are turf battles, what have you, between capital markets regulators and banking regulators, the SEC specifically, the Fed on the other hand. And I actually don't think about it in terms of this being about a turf battle. It's to Paul's point, but to put in these terms, a regulator's mission matters, right, in terms of the trade-offs that they're ultimately going to be prepared to make. So if you think about capital markets and the different institutions that are in our capital markets, the traditional purview, if you will, of the SEC. It's not about the SEC and its turf versus the Fed and its turf, et cetera. It's that the SEC has a particular mission. Capital markets regulators have a particular mission. And that's going to inform the trade-offs they're prepared to make when it comes to the policy judgments that then flow through to the rules of the road. Well, if you have a very different mission, if you have a safety and soundness mission, you're going to stand ready to make a different set of trade-offs than if your mission is investor protection, fair orderly markets, capital formation, kind of speaking to investor choice, opportunities to earn the upside, even if it means you take on some risk of the downside. Those are 2 very different perspectives. And so I think when it comes to thinking about, not just if you go back to the FSOC discussion, but if you think about the role of the FSB, you think about the role of IOSCO, you think about lots of these other bodies, not only one, each different country needs to be mindful of its broader institutional infrastructure and what's going to work for them. It's not to say you don't cooperate and you don't learn, but you need to understand that there are differences across jurisdictions. But number 2, the source of the pressure of the suasion, and what's the lens through which that group is looking at it. Are they looking at it through the same lens, with the same mission, with the same goal, with the same objective and purpose? If not, what they are looking to do may be great by virtue of their objective, but I got a different objective. And I need to be faithful to the objective I have if I'm, say, a regulator at the SEC. I think that's a very simple way of capturing it. Mission matters, and keeping an eye on that point, and it plays itself out through a lot of the different discussions we've been having.
I think that's 100% true. I mean, this is not just questions about jurisdiction grabbing or that kind of thing. It really is that people are trying to be true to their mandates, and the statutes under which they operate are very different. They have different missions, different focus, and it makes it very challenging when they're asked to sort of come together and reach consensus through either the FSOC or the FSB.
So now that we've taken a look back, and I want to make sure we leave some time for questions at the end, let's take a quick look to the future. And Troy, I seem to keep coming back to you with sort of these difficult, vague questions, but
He's the professor.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. One thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is, there is criticism saying, the SEC has, certain things on its rulemaking agenda, and they could be choosing other things. If you're in the seat of the SEC chair and there's a law that says that the SEC shall implement certain rules, how should the SEC chair prioritize the SEC's agenda if he or she might not, in their own view, agree with a rulemaking mandate that's imposed by law? How would you think about that?
So one question is there a deadline or not, right? If there's no deadline, that may have some impact in terms of how things get prioritized. That's one consideration. Another consideration, though, is kind of the big picture, which is ultimately you got to do what you think is going to be right by way of mission, by way of the overall mandate of the agency. Being pragmatic and certainly being properly respectful of the directives of Congress, I think, is consistent with all of that. If you find yourself in a circumstance, though, where you really say, look, we have many, many other things we need to do, and even a stronger version of that, I actually think doing this thing is going to maybe do more harm than good, right? You can go down that path as well. I think part of it is spending time with the appropriate members of Congress and explaining how you're thinking about it, your choices, how you want to prioritize, right? Trying to explain, not just be seen as saying no, but explain how doing something a little bit later is actually in the greater good of the agency's mission and the goals that's shared. I think that's a part of it. But then you get to the actual doing it, right? When it comes to doing the rulemaking, if you get to that point, or when you get to that point, and let's assume you have a rule that you really just disagree with. So this isn't just a matter of how do you prioritize and thinking about the opportunity cost of that time and effort, which is a real cost of any undertaking. What aren't you doing that actually is a higher and better use of agency resources? But let's assume you've crossed that divide, and you say, okay, we're going to do this. And the question, how do you do it? What do you do? And if you have a rulemaking that you actually disagree with, there are still ways to do it that are better than worse. Even if on net you think it's still not the right thing to do. So what are some ways, setting aside getting into hypotheticals and substantive details that we could string out, but a couple of techniques. One is disclosure an option as compared to a substantive mandate, right? Disclosure-based rule as compared to substantive rule. That's one approach, and that's entirely consistent with the animating philosophy for the federal securities laws. So not anything that's outside of what is core to the agency. But number two, and related to that, is the greater use of defaults. Right? I mean, we often think of either you mandate something or you do nothing. There's a middle ground, which is you do a default that you let parties opt out of. And that's something, frankly, that Cass Sunstein, when he was head of OIRA, talked about. I mean, Cass Sunstein talked about more disclosure-based regulation as compared to substantive-based regulation. Talked about greater use of defaults and opt-outs. So those are some techniques that aren't fast and loose with an obligation, but say, hey, here's a way to move forward. Here's a way to strike appropriate balances, and it's something that folks who have a lot of different perspectives on policy have recognized can be an effective technique for rulemaking.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, if you look back at, especially Dodd-Frank, so the 111th Congress adopted that with hardly any substantive hearings, like Annette mentioned the Volcker Rule is one, but, a lot of the other, especially Title IX, which affects the SEC, and then Title 15, of course, with conflict minerals and whatnot, this Christmas tree of all these different mandates it was really crazy, right? That was sprinkled around this statute. And unfortunately, I think, even when Congress changed and we got the 112th Congress coming in, the SEC didn't change at all, and unfortunately, so the chairman at the time pushed through what were the most politicized of the different rules, and so when you look at the SEC has maybe done about 50% of the rules, something like that. There's still, excuse me, really important rules that are left to be done that are tied more to the financial crisis than some of the ones that had been adopted here in the last or 3 years ago or something like that. So I think that's just a real problem. And if you look at Sarbanes-Oxley and compared to what happened with Dodd-Frank, look at all of the real partisan 3-2 votes that have come down over the last 5 years or whatever it is. I think that's truly a shame. And when you look back to what happened on Sarbanes-Oxley, I mean, people worked together. A lot of that was Harvey Pitt, I think, to his credit, trying to work on a consensus among folks. But almost all of those, I think, that I remember were unanimous votes of the commission. They might not have been perfect rules, but anyway, I think that had a completely different spirit by which we tackled those things. So I think that's the real tragedy of the whole thing. And then one last story, 19H, coming out of, if you remember way back in mind of the Market Reform Act in 1990, it was large trader reporting rule. But I was there both with Richard Breeden and Arthur Levitt when they decided, well, you know what, we have tons of other things to do. This is, maybe not the best use of our time. So even though it was in statute, Dodd-Frank now, basically adopted something even, more intrusive than what 19H contemplated. But anyway, so for that just was not, really front and center. There were a lot of other things to do.
I think given the magnitude of Dodd-Frank and the Christmas tree approach that it clearly had in some cases, there probably are more provisions there that the SEC has had some difficulty grappling with and realizing that they're basically under a mandate to do rulemaking for, but it's not something that was central to their mission. So conflict minerals obviously was the classic one. What I find interesting is it must be a tremendous challenge for them when they don't necessarily see the benefit of a rule to then do the cost-benefit analysis and on things where they've had a passion, they've been challenged on the cost-benefit and not done well on all occasions. So it must be particularly difficult when it's a rulemaking that they don't think was well, based on a statutory provision that they don't think was well advised, and then because whether it's mandated by Congress or not, they still have to do the cost benefit.
And one of the real risks to exactly your point, Annette, is when the agency, or probably any agency, when they're asked to do something that either they really don't think is the right thing to do, or it's just outside the scope of expertise because it's outside the mission, it's outside what they do, the risks go up considerably that the consequence will actually be that more harm than good is done, which means you have all the time, the effort, you put the commission in a very difficult position, the hardworking staff in a very difficult position, only to find out that at the end of the road, not only did things not improve, but things have a very significant chance of actually deteriorating. That's a bad place on policy grants, it's a bad place on time, effort, expense, and the rest. So exactly your point.
I want to turn in a second to questions from folks in the audience, but just in terms of the last question, Paul, since we're talking about Congress, what are some ideas that you have in terms of what Congress should think about doing to change the federal securities laws, if anything?
Well, I have 2 hours to talk about that, right? No, so obviously repeal and replace Dodd-Frank would be I would put that at the top of the list. And so I think the work that Chairman Hensarling's doing, I think will be very, interesting to see what he comes up with, and especially with respect to treating Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and addressing that whole issue, and they are doing exactly what they did before the financial crisis. But now the scary thing for all of us taxpayers is that we are now truly on the hook. Beforehand, it was the implicit guarantee. Now it's a full guarantee, and they're doing exactly the same thing. So, I think it's high time for that to be addressed. There are other things. I mean, there are a lot of issues. SRO status, the self-regulatory organizations. If you have the chairman or the head of the of one of them call his group an independent regulatory organization rather than a self-regulatory organization. I think it's high time that Congress look again at this whole issue and reassess, what does a self-regulatory organization mean, and what's the transparency issues, due process, rule of law, and all of that. And there are other issues out there, 14A8, which has to do with shareholder proposals. This is mainly a creature of court, of judge-made law, going back to a decision called Dow Chemical against, I think, Médecins Sans Frontières or something like that. I don't remember what the group was. But anyway, back into the 70s, where the D.C. Circuit said, oh, yeah, if you see something on the front page of the newspaper, then that's something germane for the shareholders to discuss at a corporate meeting, which is, not, I think, the best use of shareholder time, and doesn't really adhere to corporate governance as laid out by the various states. So I think it's high time that 14A8 be looked at again. And there are other ancillary issues with respect to 10b-5, Halliburton case, and things like that, Basic versus Levinson with respect to class action lawsuits. But the main thing I would hope is, to us to find ways to try to depoliticize the SEC. Maybe that's impossible in the current political climate, but I really do think that most of these issues should not be political. They're all about, what's best for investors. And to be an investor, you need to have a couple of nickels to rub together in order to invest. And too many of the politicized activists are not investors, and they kind of get into the head, what do we think investors want to do? But they're not investors. They have no idea of really the approach and the ramifications of some of the things that they advocate. So anyway, with that,
So with that, if it's okay with everybody, let's open it up, and if anybody in the audience has questions, raise your hand. And before asking the question, it'd be great if you could introduce yourself and allow for someone with a microphone to come over. So.
Ramon Bueller with the Madison Coalition. And talked about, Troy, you talked about regulatory overreach. And looking ahead over the next 20 years at what is likely to happen in the regulation of capital markets, I'd be interested in what each or any of you think about the idea that's been advanced in Congress and elsewhere that major new federal regulations should be approved by Congress. And of course, it doesn't look like that's going to happen in Congress alone, but there's an effort now by states, similar to the one that states used to force Congress to propose the Bill of Rights, where now 19 state legislative chambers have asked Congress to propose a constitutional amendment that would require that major new regulations be approved by Congress. Your thoughts?
Well, I'm happy to take that one first. But so there have been a lot of ideas over time, the REINS Act and other things, which I think are really salutary. You have, unfortunately, with Dodd-Frank, and the reason why the SEC is so politicized now is that Congress didn't do its job. It passed 2,319 pages of a statute that had all sorts of mandates, but they didn't have any hearings. They didn't figure out they didn't make any decisions on how it should be approached. They just kind of punted it to the various agencies. And so then you're stuck with the non-elected, really politically non-accountable people, commissioners making these decisions in most cases, and then staff, otherwise who are completely, not even responsible to the political, winds going either way. So it really is incumbent, I think, on Congress to make these decisions and be responsible, and then to have a view of, to have a chance to either approve or disapprove rules. The trouble is there are so many thousands of rules that come out, and the thousands of pages in the Federal Register with rules being published. You have to focus on, which ones are important and which ones are not. OMB has that kind of process down, so at least there's some definition. But it is a huge issue, and the more Congress delegates, the less it's, in the proper sphere of being debated, publicly and in Congress and by the people who are immediately accountable to the electorate.
Just to hit the other side of the coin is the importance of keeping focus on the analysis done at the agencies, right? So we can just shorthand that in terms of cost-benefit analysis, the focus on data, because they're going to have, and however much, right, they're going to have a lot of power, a lot of authority. With Dodd-Frank, we see that's grown. It will, ebb and flow over the decades. But the importance of how those agencies go about discharging their responsibilities, just from the perspective of sound decision-making, which again is the cost-benefit, couple that with a retrospective review, more by way of economics and data, and then I think laying out the analysis and explaining the trade-offs. I think one of the virtues, from my perspective, of this kind of rigorous cost-benefit analysis is when you say, look, here's the analysis, here's how things could go well, here's how things could go poorly, and here's how at least a majority of this agency is prepared to trade those things off. And let that be known and open and transparent. I think that's just healthy government, if you will, and I think important for that to continue to take further root and just be the way things get done.
Yeah, I don't think it would be possible or advisable to have Congress approve every new federal regulation. Congress has enough difficulty passing anything, and so it's clearly brilliantly designed to have no new federal regulations of any kind, but which is probably where you'd end up. But there are already protections in place. If you have a major rule, there's a delay in when when the rule can be implemented, so that Congress has the ability to go back and act before it's put into place if it thinks it was ill-advised. I think it really would be sort of counter to this notion of independent agency. Once Congress decides what they want in the legislation, they really do have to delegate to the agency that has the ability to do the analytics, that is required to do the cost benefit, that has the expertise to promulgate the rules.
If you have a question over here.
Hi, Thea Knight of the Cato Institute. I have a question that you've kind of all touched on, but I might want to dig a little bit deeper into it, which is the concept of materiality, which I think in the past we all kind of thought that, it meant return on investment, but obviously there are now investors who say, no, we're interested in things like political contributions or conflict minerals. How would you suggest the SEC approach this? Do we need to think about what materiality is, or is our understanding of it in the past still relevant, and some of these other concerns are really not part of what corporate disclosures should include?
Well, I think it's now more important than ever because you have again, like I kind of discussed earlier, about you have groups out there with ulterior motives, right? So they are not necessarily just interested in X because of X. They're interested in it because of other things that they think that they can achieve from their own political stances that they can't achieve elsewhere, and they view, the path of least resistance is to either, agitate so that the SEC adopts some rule or get Congress to do it or something like that. But it really then dissipates what we talk about. If we truly think that investors should be able to pick up a disclosure statement and then decide whether to buy, sell, or hold a particular investment, and we're geared towards the average reasonable investor, not to somebody who has some special proclivities, and then mandate, because again, every mandate has costs and has other repercussions that ensue from government requiring something. If people who want to find out about a certain type of thing, ask companies or agitate or something like that on their own, then and there's a market for that, and that there are a lot of companies out there that have responded to that, and so that then ought to attract those investors, and those companies ought to be presumably happier to get those investors, or the investors will direct their money in that way and not to others. So there is a market even in those sorts of things, and we've seen that play out with respect to some things in the past, even, like sanctions against South Africa and whatnot, that you didn't necessarily need a government mandate. There was a lot of private ordering that achieved what some of the groups wanted. So, and again, I think we're talking about ultimately shareholders and investors who are bearing the burden of all these costs. And there's a lot of, and so I think the government needs to be very careful before it starts putting down mandates in that effect.
And I think when you think about materiality as it's unfolded in the courts over the decades, part of it is to address the avalanche of information concern, the information overload concern. But I think exactly to your question, part of it too is such that materiality is with an orientation towards the mission behind the federal securities laws, which is not to say that there aren't other missions that may be laudable, but they're just not the mission that the federal securities laws is about. And so to start using or reinterpreting, in my view, reconceiving, rethinking about kind of these cornerstone features in a way that would actually start to change what the federal securities laws are about runs very considerable risk, frankly, in terms of uncertainty, lack of predictability, what's in fashion today, what's in fashion tomorrow, what's in fashion, in fashion down the line. Where are the contours then once you start going down? That's not a slippery slope argument. I think that's just would be the natural evolution. And so materiality has the shape that it has. It's been reinforced over decades of jurisprudence. I think my personal view is it has served investors and our markets well, and that it ought to be preserved and adhered to on a going forward basis.
Well, and the thing is, to that point, if you give up the touchstone of materiality, then disclosure becomes a plaything of whatever kind of majority you can cobble together among the 5 commissioners at the SEC. And then I think then it becomes a truly random type of system, and I don't think that serves anybody well. And then you get into the ulterior motives and other shenanigans that can go on, the name and shame issue and all of that. And so you are affecting then through the laws that were not conceived to do that in the first place, actual behavior then in the marketplace. And I don't think that's what our securities laws should be about. And so thus, I think Thurgood Marshall and TSC Industries versus Northway or whatever it was right when he talked about materiality and the disclosure system.
David Burton with the Heritage Foundation. Small and startup companies have a macroeconomically significant effect on innovation and job creation. Yet until the Congress passed the Jobs Act, the SEC had somewhere between, or paid almost no attention or no attention to the regulatory burden on small and startup companies. I was wondering what you all thought was the reason for that, what could be done to increase the SEC's focus on the regulatory burden on small and startup companies and small public companies, and what substantive changes you think would be most salutary in effect on the impact on small startup and small public companies.
Well, all right. Well, that's I think that's a great question. And if you look back at the Jobs Act and how back in 2012, it was kind of like a perfect storm in favor of something like the Jobs Act. You had a president who, wanted to be reelected and was focusing on, what can I say that I've done with respect to, increasing jobs. And you had folks in Congress, of course, who felt that there was a huge burden on startup companies. And you look at the number of IPOs having plummeted, and even now, there's been a bit of an uptick. Probably because of the Jobs Act, but still in the doldrums as far as what it was historically in the United States. I think there are myriad reasons for that, and mostly regulatory burdens on companies. And even besides reporting requirements and things like that, but just sort of the mechanics of going public and just the process of between professionals and everything else. But that's not to say that there aren't good ideas out there. We'll see now. Crowdfunding, is just now about really allowed to take off, and I think the SEC is, finally appropriately, gone forward and with respect to the rules there, and so I'm looking forward to seeing how that works. And sure, there's a possibility of fraud coming out of things like that, but you know what? That happens. That's the potential in almost anything in the capital markets. So we have to, but we have to try things and see, and then hopefully regulators and enforcement folks will be vigilant, to stop would-be fraudsters. So, but we'll see how that takes off, and I think that's the main thing I'm looking forward to seeing how it comes about.
Yeah, I think Paul's right. The concern is about investor protection. I mean, the concern was that if you lifted some of these requirements, it would be inconsistent with investor protection because you might have more fraud in this area. I think it will remain to be seen now with some of these Jobs Act changes. It certainly seemed to me that the Commission was a little uncomfortable with some of what they were required to do in the Jobs Act, but Congress spoke, and we'll see, how it comes out, and they'll have to monitor it carefully. But I certainly agree with you that it is important to encourage, capital formation by, encouraging small companies. The SEC had an Office of Small Business within the Division of Corporation Finance, but I don't think it was a, front and center priority by any means.
So I would just add a couple of quick points. I think watching how 506C plays out, watching how Reg A Plus plays out, watching how crowdfunding plays out, and standing ready to make improvements to try to make sure those have real life. Again, we're going to see how this is going to play itself out. So I think, one, keeping an eye on what's already been put in place. Number two, continuing to think about innovative other approaches, including venture exchanges, and what kinds of legislative or regulatory changes may need to be made in order to allow for at least venture exchanges to have a shot if there are folks who are so inclined. And then third is on the point about investor protection and capital formation. Those are often framed as if it's one or the other. And I think what's important is to think about capital formation in investor protection terms in the following sense, that yes, protecting investors against downside, fraud, abuse, manipulation, what have you, is certainly cornerstone to investor protection, but so is allowing them the chance to invest. And so when you think about expanded investment opportunities, we think about that as being good for the issuers who raise the money and then go do what they do, and that's good for employees and consumers and communities, et cetera. But in many, many, many instances, it proves to be good for the investors who have a chance to invest, either because they believe in the enterprise and or because they actually are investing in something that's going to have a lot of financial success down the line. So I think as we start to think about, or if we can more broadly start thinking about capital formation as serving fundamental investor interests and not just issuer interest, I think that too may open up the possibilities in terms of being willing to do more to try to foster capital formation, particularly for small business, but for businesses of all sizes.
So we're a few minutes after 2, so unfortunately I think we should wrap it up with apologies for anybody who didn't get a chance to ask your question. So I wanted to say one more time, Paul, Annette, Troy, thanks so much. This was great. And also to all of you who came, thanks again, and hope you enjoyed it.